Dalet Parshios, this coming Shabbos, we will read Parsha Zohar. And usually B'nai Torah and Medaktik and Mitzvahs are very makbid in the Kriya of Parsha Zohar, because it is probably the only Kriya in the entire year that is Min HaTorah. So this is the topic with which we start today's shir, is the Kriya of Parsha Zohar Min HaTorah. Shalosh Machloikes B'Davar. Brochas Yud Gimel Amud Aleph, the Gemara deals with the question: Haim Torah Beloshin Kodesh Nitno or Bekoloshoin? And Rashi says, Lamayin Afkemina. What would be the difference? Kriyas HaTorah. So many mitzvahs we could be Mekayim Bekoloshoin, Tefillin Emeres Bekoloshoin. But if the Torah was given Beloshin HaKodesh, then you need to Kriyas HaTorah Beloshin HaKodesh. And Tosfos wonders, but Kriyas HaTorah is only midrabanan. Tkonas Ezra, Tkonas Moshe Rabbeinu. So what would the nafkamina be? And Tosfos says there are parshios that we need to read Min HaTorah. Mayre bepashios hamachiyov and likros diuraisa kamo Parsha Zohar. What does Tosfos mean? Kamo Parsha Zohar. Is there anything besides Parsha Zohar? You might be surprised. Yes. The Beis Yosef says Tosfos means also Parsha Parah, not only Parsha Zohar. Parsha Zohar is a chiddush. Parsha Parah would be a chiddush al gabei chiddush. But in Tosfos Shans, yes, in Tosfos Shans we find Parshas Parah Aduma and Parsha Zohar. Shas Vermaiza, before Shas Vilna conquered the entire market, the Vermaiza Shas was very broadly accepted, and in the Vermaiza Shas, we find in the Gers of Tosfos, Parsha Zohar and Parshas Parah. So what we learn from this Tosfos is Parsha Zohar is the basic requirement of the mitzvah dioraisa shel schiras maseh Amalek. You need to read this parsha, and therefore, leman domar kol haTorah b'loshen kodesh ne'emra, you need to read the parsha in loshen kodesh. But there still is no hechleach from Tosfos that we mean reading the parsha b'tzibur on Shabbos Zohar. We could still assume, based on Tosfos, every individual needs to read the parasha from a Sefer Torah, from a Chumash, even by heart. All we find in Tosfos is that to be Mekayim the mitzvah schiras maseh Amalek, you need to read the original parasha, which is at the end of Parshas Ki Teitzei. When, where, how? Nothing in Tosfos. But the Rosh goes far beyond Tosfos, and the Rosh is in Perek Zayin and Brochas Siman Chof and the Gemara Brochas Mem Zayin, when the Gemara says Rebbe Eliezer Shichre Rav Doi Kedei L'Tzar for the Minyan, and the Gemara asks it's an Aveda to free an Eved La'olam Be'em Tavoidum, and the Gemara says Mitzvah Shani, and then the Gemara says but it's a Mitzvah B'Ov Aveda, and the Gemara says Mitzvah Derabim. So the Rosh wants to prove that even a mitzvah derabanan, if it's a mitzvah derabim, would justify freeing an eved. Because Tosfos says that it's not mistaver that the story of Rebbe Eliezer Sheshich L'Ravdoi is dafka Shabbos Zohar. Unlikely that it was Shabbos Zohar. So what seems to be clear in Tosfos, that the Kriya ba'asara with a minyan of Parsha Zohar is Min HaTorah. So that is why Rebbe Eliezer had a need to free his Eved, because he didn't have a minyan, and it is Min HaTorah. So what seems to be clear in the Rosh, beyond what we learn from Tosfos, that the mitzvah dioraisa is reading this parsha, what seems to be clear from the Rosh, reading the Parsha B'tzibur. And it's so difficult to explain. Why would that be in a Torah? Would it be Aloha L'Moshe Messinai? So in Gedolei Achronim, we find two different approaches, and both would seem to be far-fetched. Keren Oiro. In Brochas Daf Keren Oiro says, Schiras Mas Amalek is associated with Mechias Amalek. We need to remember that ultimately, when time comes, we will need to fight Amalek. That is what we need to remember. So, Kamo Mechias Amalek, which is a mitzvah al tzibur, Schiras Mas Amalek is also al tzibur, and al tzibur means Asora Miyisrael. That's the Keren Oiro. Pu'ula Sochio is a Perushan Mas HaRav min Hogei Agro. It is a Doiv Ber, one of the Talmidei Hagon, and in Kuf Lamed Gimel, Ois Kuf Lamed Gimel, in Mas HaRav, he puts up an argument and it says, Chazal say, Ein Shumay Sholem, ve'ein Kisei Sholem, ad she'yamocha zecher Amalek. So Shem Shemayim would only be magnified by Mechias Amalek, and therefore, Schiras Mas Amalek has a din of a Dover Shebigdusha, and a Dover Shebigdusha necessitates a Sorah Miyisrael. Both are Gavaldige Chedushim. Opinion number 3 is the Rambam. Rambam Sefer HaMitzvos, Mitzvos Aseh Kuf Peites, and once again in Perek Hei of Hilchos Malachim, it is clear in the Rambam that the mitzvah d'oraisa of Schiras Mas Amalek is not associated with any specific parsha in the Torah. Kol echod ve'echod lefi tzachos l'shoina. You could choose your own words, but you need to tell the story to your children. We have the Rambam on our screen. Shitzivono lizkar ma she'oseh lanu Amalek, b'akdimoi lehareya lanu. He was the first to torment Klal Yisrael and to fight us. V'lisnoi yoseh b'kol eis v'na'orer ha'nefoshes b'mamorim le'ilochem boi. V'nazar zoam lisnoi yoseh ad sheloi teshochech ha'mitzvah v'loi techlas shinosoi v'techsom ha'nefoshes ha'borech hazman. He doesn't mention how. What exactly are we supposed to say? You need to share with your children and pass on from one generation to the other the story of Amalek. And the same is in Perek Hei of Hilchos Malachim. The Ramban, Parshas Kiseitz, the Ramban al Torah is Mesupik. Is the mitzvah associated with reading the parsha or just telling the story? Ma de pshita le Rambam mechad, ma de pshita le metoises meidach, misapkele le Ramban. And the Ramban is Mesupik, Tosfos or Rambam. So these are the 3 most important sources defining the mitzvah d'oraisa of Schiras Mas Amalek. According to the Rambam, and one side of the Ramban, choose your own words. Just like Berchas Hamazon d'oraisa. Kol echod lefi tzachos l'shoinoi. It's not a specific parsha. So on mitzvahs d'oraisa, we find 2 different definitions. Kriya Shema. Kriya Shema, you need to read this specific parsha. Mitzad Sheni Berchas HaTorah, Berchas Hamazon are also d'oraisa. Choose your words. You just need to give gratitude and thanks to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But you formulate it as you wish. That's the opinion of the Rambam Schiras Mas Amalek. According to Tosfos, you need to read the parsha. According to the Rosh, it seems you need to read the parsha b'minyan and maybe Shabbos Zohar. Shulchan Aruch twice writes like the Rosh, and that's a surprise. Tofresh Pei Siv Zayin, Kuf Mem Vav and Hilchos Kriyas HaTorah Siv Beis. Shulchan Aruch writes at Parsha Zohar and Parshas Porah min HaTorah. La'niyas daiti. And what I say now might seem as a chiddush to many. Yesh oimrem, Parshas Zohar v'Parshas Porah Aduma chayovam l'kroisam min HaTorah. That is Tofresh Pei Yesh oimrem. In Kuf Mem Vav, the Mechaber doesn't even write Yesh oimrem. The Mechaber writes as if Miltza de Pshita, that these kriyas are min HaTorah. Here it is. The Parshas Zohar, the Parshas Porah Shem ba'asora mid'oraisa. And this is a gewaltige chiddush, as I said before. La'ani is daiti. La'ani is daiti. My feeling is, even the Rosh and the Shulchan Aruch, the Bes Yosef, mean to say ikroi min ha-Torah. And the Rosh is the same as Tosfos. Min ha-Torah, you need to read this parsha. Chachamim came along and they said, we want you to be mekayim the mitzvah d'oraisa every year. Shabbos before Purim, in the Beis Knesses bi'asora. Not that min ha-Torah, you need to read it bi'asora, but it's a mitzvah d'oraisa. Reading this parsha is a mitzvah d'oraisa. Asora, exactly when, that is midrabanan. But it's a mitzvah chamura and a kriya chamura because ikroi min ha-Torah. That would be my understanding. Now, there's a machlokes Mogen Avraham and Mishnah Brura, Tov Reish Pei Hey. Does it necessarily need to be Parshas Kiseitzai? Or you could also be Yoitza with Parshas B'Shalach. Because at the end of B'Shalach, we also find Parshas Amalek. The difference between the two Parashiyos. In Parshas B'Shalach, the story of Amalek's treachery is more ba'arichis. Parshas B'Shalach tells the story. B'derech, b'tzeis Yisrael me'Mitzrayim, and Amalek was the first to attack us. V'hu oyev v'yogea, v'lo yorei Elokim. And in Parshas B'Shalach, HaKadosh Baruch Hu promises, Mochoi emche ezecher Amalek metachas hashamayim. At the end of Parshas Kiseitzei, there is no real description of Rishas Amalek. But on the other hand, in Parshas Kiseitzei, we have the mitzvah asay, which is upon us, Timcha Zeicha Amalek Metachas Hashamayim. So the Mogen Avraham quotes a psak from the Shlo. The Shlo says, if a person could choose one of two options, he could go right and he'll make it to a shul for Shabbos and hear the Kriya of Zohar. But that shul doesn't have a Megillah, and he'll miss Mikra Megillah. He could go left to a different town, and he'll get there by Purim to hear the Megillah, but then he'll miss the Kriya of Parashat Zohar. Which comes first? Shlo HaKodesh says, Megillah is Medirei Kabbalah. Parashat Zohar is Min ha-Torah. So we need to put Zohar before Mikra Megillah. Mogen Avraham disagrees, and he comes up with a gewaldige chiddush. If you're going to be in a shul on Purim in the morning, we read the parshas of Parshas B'Shalach, Vayovay Amalek. And you could yoitza with that parsha as well. You yoitza min ha-Torah with Vayovay Amalek and Parshas B'Shalach. Mishnah Brura Sif Koten Tez Zayin disagrees with the Mogen Avraham, and he argues, the mitzvah of Schiras Masa Amalek is to remember the Chiyuv Timche Zecher Amalek Metachas Hashamayim. And that is why the Mishnah Brura disagrees with the Mogen Avraham. Because according to the Mishnah Brura, what we are mechuyev to remember is our mitzvah of Mechias Amalek. And that is only in Parshas Kiteitzei. It's not in Parshas B'Shalach. So how do we understand the Machlokes Mishnah Brura and Mogen Avraham? I think the question is, in essence, what exactly do we need to remember, and why do we need to remember? So we quoted the Rambam before in Mitzvah Sesei Kuf Peites. The Rambam says, you need to remember and to invoke the sinner, tell this, the horrible story of Amalek, was the first of all the nations to torment and to kill and to fight Bnei Yisrael. And we need to remember that we should fight them ultimately. That supports the Mishnah Brura's approach. So you can't be Yosef with Parshas B'Shalach. Parshas B'Shalach HaKadosh Baruch Hu promises, but we need to remember our mitzvah. The Mogen Avraham obviously maintains that no, the mitzvah of Schira is not necessarily associated with the mitzvah of Mechiyah. We need to remember Rishas Amalek. And the Rambam in Perek Hey, Hilchos Malachim, does not mention what the Rambam says in Sefer HaMitzvos. The Rambam says, Sheniskor eivosoi va'arevosoi, but the Rambam doesn't mention, we need to remember the rishas of Amalek, not more. The Ramban even goes beyond that, and the Ramban says, we need to remember rishas Amalek and bear in mind when a Kodesh Baruch Hu will ultimately destroy Amalek, Lo lechinam, it'll be for a good reason. According to the Ramban's explanation, it would even occur to us that Parshas B'Shalach is even better than Parshas Kiseitze. Because Parshas B'Shalach, there's a more vivid description of Rishas Amalek. And in Parshas B'Shalach, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Mochoi emche zeicher Amalek metachas hashamayim. And the Ramban says, why do we need to remember Rishas Amalek? To understand and to appreciate that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu will be moiche zeicher Amalek, it'll be for a good reason. So I think the Magen Avraham and the Mishnah Brura, their machlokes, manifests itself in a more fundamental question: what exactly do we need to remember and why? And the second side of the same coin is not only the machlokes, could we be yoitze with Parshas B'Shalach or only Parshas Kiseitzer? Are noshim exempt from this mitzvah, or noshim are included? And that's a big machlokes. Interesting, there is only one of all of the Rishonim dealing with this question. That's a big surprise. I'm aware of only one Rishon that deals with the question, are women chayiv in Schiras Masi Amalek? And that is the Sefer HaChinuch. Sefer HaChinuch Tov Reish Gimel says, noshim are exempt. And why? Because noshim don't wage war. Darko shel ish lichboish ve'ein darko shel isha lichboish. So women would not be b'chlal the mitzvah of Mechias Amalek, and that is why they also are exempt from Schiras Masi Amalek. The Minchas Chinuch disagrees. So, noheges mitzvah zu b'kol makom b'kol zman b'schorim ki lehem rasas melchoma v'nakomes u'oyev v'lo lenoshim. And on the spot, the Minchas Chinuch wonders, it's a mitzvah sasei she'enas mangrama. Because Shabbos Zohar is definitely only midirabonon. Min haTorah there is no zman kavua. And then the Minchas Chinuch wonders, how does the Chinuch know that the mitzvah of Sechira is associated with the mitzvah of Mechiyah? Actually, the Minchas Chinuch touches upon a machlokes in the Rishonim. He's not aware of it. He doesn't quote the Ramban al Torah and the Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvahs. But l'chorah, the argument of the Minchas Chinuch and the Chinuch depends, what is it that we're supposed to remember? So the Chinuch follows in the footsteps of the Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvahs. We need to remember that we got to fight him. And that is why this mitzvah is not noyeg b'noshim. The Minchas Chinuch understands, no, it's a mitzvah to say, she'enas mangrama, and noshim should be chayiv. The other comment is, melchemes mitzvah. Women are b'chlal melchemes mitzvah. But this is a machlokes, and it's a big pella that the Chinuch is the only one of the Rishonim dealing with the question, are women chayav or potur? And this brings us very close to the Shaila Aloch HaMaisa. The women need to go to shul to hear Kriyas HaTorah in Parshas Zohar. So the Sefer HaChinuch says, Noshim Bechlal don't even have the mitzvah diuraisa. The Minchas Chinuch says they do have the mitzvah diuraisa. But that is not nogeya to the mitzvah dirabonon of Kriyas HaTorah. So the Chafetz Chaim, one of his amazing svarim is Sefer Mitzvahs HaKotzah. The Chafetz Chaim is known for eternity in the schus of his two monumental works. There's not a frum Jew in the entire world that isn't familiar and doesn't learn Mishnah Brura. And Chafetz Chaim is Shmiras HaLashon. But the Chafetz Chaim wrote many svarim. And one of the special svarim of Chafetz Chaim is Sefer Mitzvahs HaKotzah. What is the essence of the Sefer? Following in the footsteps of the great Rishonim that wrote Sifrei Mitzvahs, the Rambam and the Ramban, based on the Rambam, Sefer HaChinuch, the Smak, the Yereim. The very first one was the Halachas Gedolos, Rabbeinu Sadia Goin. So the Chofetz Chaim wrote his own Sefer HaMitzvahs, but he compiled, it's a compilation only of the mitzvahs say, Hanoyagois Bizman Hazeh. The Chofetz Chaim felt that it's important not only to learn Halacha L'Maaseh, Esa Derech Neilach Bo V'Esa Ma'aseh Asher Yasun, but also we should familiarize ourselves with the essence of the mitzvahs that are Noyeg Bizman Hazeh. And that's why he brought together not all the mitzvahs say Reish Mem Ches, like the Rambam and the Chinuch that deal with the entirety of Taryag. The Chofetz Chaim wrote a very brief analysis and description of all the mitzvahs say that are noeg b'zman hazeh. And mitzvah ayin vav, Chofetz Chaim writes that this mitzvah is noeg ba'anoshim u'binoshim, lo kedivrei chinuch. Same approach as the minchas chinuch. So let's deal with the question: the woman need to come to shul to hear the kriya of Parshas Zochar. For the past 24 years, I'm living in Yerushalayim, and Yerushalayim, the minhag is noshim flock to shuls as if it's a chiyuv gamur. I don't know what the minhag in America, in your communities, is, but this is a big machlokes. The three sources I just quoted, Sefer HaChinuch, Minchas Chinuch, Sefer HaMitzvahs of the Chofetz Chaim, deal with the mitzvah d'oraisa, not necessarily with the mitzvah d'rabbanan of Shmiras Parshas Zochar. I think the first source in chronological order is the Shalosh Teshuvos Binyan Zion Chelik Beis Siman Ches. This is a sefer I quote a lot, Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger, best known for the series of Svarim Oruch Lener. He was a great gadol. And whenever I mention Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger, it's amazing. The Shoel HaMeishev corresponds. Let's go to the bottom of the page. Siman Ches, that's it. The Shoel HaMeishev corresponds with most of the Gedolim of this generation, including the Divrei Chaim and the Chidush Harim. But only one gadol gets the title of Ish Elokim from the Shoel HaMeishev, and that's Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger, the Yeki, not the Rebbe, not the Tzanzerov, not the Gerer Rebbe, but Dafka Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger, Ish Elokim. That's the title the Shoel HaMeishev gives him. So in Siman Ches, we just need to read the first two lines. Tshuva kibalti ma'admar, Tshuva kibalti ma'admar agon Reb Avrom Bing, Gaivet Würzburg. One of my Talmidim is presently the Rav in Würzburg. Great Gedolim were in Würzburg. So the Orach Lener quotes Reb Avrom Bing, B'shem Rabbi Achoset Shebekun Agon Reb Nosan Adler, Shanoshim Chayavois, V'shekpid Shafilo Mishareses Shelo, even the maid, there was a Jewish maid in his house, she should go to shul. Hutzach Ol Shmoya Parshas Zochar, V'chein Nohagti HaRav. So he quotes the chinuch and the minchas chinuch, and he goes into a pilpul. But what is important? Reb Nosan Adler was makbid, women should go to shul. We find the same in Droshes Chassam Sofer. So obviously, Chassam Sofer was noyeh kemineg Rabbi Hagodol Reb Nosan Adler. From all my inquiries, I think that was the minhag in Germany. In Eretz Ashkenaz, I think it's the minhag in Yekhish shuls today. Not many shuls, minhag Ashkenaz left today, but I think the minhag of the Yekim is that women go to hear Parshas Zochar. Teres Chesed Siman Lamed Zayin. The Teres Chesed was one of the great Gedolim of Poland and Yerushalayim. He was the Rav in Lublin, Reb Shneur Zalman in Lublin. At the end of his days, he came to Yerushalayim, and he was one of the Gedolei Yerushalayim. Siman Lamed Zayin. He writes a tshuva, dealing with the same question. And the Teres Chesed writes, Ma'olam lo shamanu, I never heard that women go to shul to hear Kriya Zohar. And what you say that you heard in the name of one of the Gedolim that woman needs to come, I'm not sure it's true. Maybe it's just hearsay. Even if it is true, it's a Das Yochid. He doesn't write who that Gadol is. But obviously, he means Ibn Adler. So the Torah's Chesed didn't see the Binyan Siyam. If he would see the Binyan Siyam, he wouldn't doubt whether it's true or not. The person that wrote to him wrote that he heard, probably, Ibn Adler was the one. So the Torah's Chesed says, I'm not sure it's true. So many stories are unreliable. If he would see Binyan Siyam heard from his great Rebbe, who was a Talmud of Ibn Adler. But nevertheless, Torah's Chesed Paskins, there's no source to be Machayev and Oshim. After all, Dalet Pashas is a din in Kriyas HaTorah. And Noshim are potter from Kriyas HaTorah. Why would there be Chayev in Parshas Zohar? What is it different than any other Kriyas HaTorah? Men HaTorah, there might be Chayev, but not Kriyas HaTorah. What is important in this tshuva is not only his psak, but the testimony. Ma'olam lo shamanu v'lo ra'inu, that Noshim go to shul to hear Parshas Zohar. How about Sephardi communities? Barzot HaMizrach. Nobody was more bookie in Monogay Sfarad than the Kaf HaChaim. Kaf HaChaim, Tov Reish Pei Hey Sif Koten Lamed, quotes Lemudei Hashem, Rabbi Yehuda Najara, one of the great Sephardi poskim going back 300 years, that Noshim are potter from Kriyas Parshas Zohar. And the Kaf HaChaim doesn't even bring one posik, Sephardi posik, that Noshim are chayiv. So the Torah's Chesed was in Poland, Kaf HaChaim Sephardi. What is even more important is Birurei Halacha. You all are familiar with Binyamin Zilber, who was one of the great Gedolim in Bnei Brak. He was known in Bnei Brak as the Binyamin HaTzadik. And he is very chashuv as Sforim in Halacha. His son was also a tremendous Talmid Chacham, and he wrote Sforim too. And he quotes in the name of Rav Duner, who was Av based in London, Zechet Tzaddik Levracha, that he heard from the daughter of the Chofetz Chaim, Rebbetzin Sachs, that the Chofetz Chaim never let the women of his household, his Rebbetzin and daughters, to go to shul to hear Shabbos Zohar. So it is clear that when the Chofetz Chaim writes in Sefer HaMitzvahs that Noshim are Chayiv, he only means to say they're Chayiv in the mitzvah diuraisa, but they don't need to go to shul. Reb Chaim Kanievsky, so the late Moshiach Tzidkani, Sarah Torah, in Talmud Dikra, he has an amazing Sefer Talmud Dikra, Parparois on Chamish Chumash Torah. At the end of the Sefer, he gives over different halachas, Mesoris from the Chazon Ish. And he writes that according to the Chazon Ish, Noshim do not need to go to shul to hear Zohar. There's a kuntris from HaRav Forsheimer, the Dayan in Lakewood, and he writes that he heard from Reb Moshe, the Igros Moshe, that women do not need to go to shul to hear Parshas Zohar. When the Bris Karov came to Yerushalayim, the Bris Karov said, it's the first time in my life that I ever heard that women go to shul to hear Parshas Zohar. Moiri Verabi, the Divrei Yatzev, Shalas Tshuvas Divrei Yatzev, Moiri Verabi HaKodosh, Kloisen Bagarov, Simen Reish Peches Orachaim, proves from a tshuva in the Divrei Chaim that women don't need to go to shul to hear Parshas Zohar. And that's Geoinus. What's the proof? The Divrei Chaim has a tshuva about the Kedusha of an Ezras Noshim. Does the women's section have the same Kedusha as the men's section? And the Divrei Chaim says no. In the men's shul, there definitely is a higher level of Kedusha, because there are Kama mitzvahs that only men perform in shuls and women don't. One of those is Kriyas HaTorah and Dalet Parshiyos. So the Divrei Chaim clearly says, Daled Parshiyos, women are not mechuyev. One of the Daled Parshiyos is Parsha Zohar. So the Kloiserboger proves from the Divrei Chaim that according to the Tzanz HaRav, Noshim are not chayev in Parsha Zohar. The same is found in Alichas Shloimeh Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. On the other hand, I quoted the Binyan Siyan Reb Nosson Adler, his Talmud Some Sefer. Reb Shilei Diskin, Kuntra Zachron, Kuv Beis, argues Noshim are chayev in the Kriya of Parsha Zohar. Munkat Sharav Minchas Elazar, Chelik Beis Siman Aleph, brings the Teres Chesed, disagrees. And he writes, Minig Yisrael Noshim come to your Parsha Zohar. And this is somewhat baffling, somewhat confusing. So how about the Hasidic world? Kloiser Magarov, based on the Divrei Chaim, says, no, Noshim don't need to come. The Minchas Elazar says, Minchas Elazar, the Munkat Sharav says, yes. Minig Yerushalayim. Reb Shilei Diskin says, yes. Reb Shlomo Zalman was born in Yerushalayim and lived all his life in Yerushalayim. Reb Shlomo Zalman was makbid that the woman of his household should go to shul, because that was the minig in Yerushalayim. But he clearly stressed his opinion, me'ikar adin, Noshim do not need to go. Sfarish world quoted the Kaf HaChaim, the Litvish world, starting off the Chofetz Chaim, the Chazon Ish, Rav Moshe Feinstein and Biskarov. I think these four names are probably the greatest names in the Litvish world the past 100 years or somewhat more. The Chofetz Chaim, Chazon Ish, Biskarov, Rav Moshe Feinstein, and they all clearly say women are not mechuyev to go to shul to hear Parsha Zohar. Minchas Yitzchak was also a Hasidic Rav in Manchester, and then he was the guy of the Eidach Haredis. Chelik Tesem Mesameches, he writes, I think Rav Poiske maintained that Noshim are chayev. To me, that's a pella. I don't think so. I think Rav Poiske say clearly Noshim are potul. I'm not aware of many Poiskim that Noshim are chayev, besides the Binyan Siyan and Reb Shilei Diskin. Minchas Elazar is an Achron Shebachronim. I don't think Rav Poiske maintained that Noshim are chayev, but what is even more important is that the minig was that Noshim didn't go. Neither in Poland, nor in Galicia, nor in Hungary, nor in Lithuania, and nor in the Sephardi Kehelis. There never was a minig that Noshim went to shul to hear Kriyat Parsha Zohar. Ani Akotan always told my wife, Zechrona Lavrocha, and my daughters, they should not go to shul to hear the Kriyat Zohar, because usually so many women come to the Ezes Noshim and it's packed, and it's almost impossible for all of them to hear the Kriyat, properly hear every word. If you miss one word, you weren't Yaitza. Kriyas Parsha Zohar is like Kriyas Shema. If you skipped one word, you weren't Yaitza. And if you come to shul, very unlikely that you hear every word. So my wife, Zechrona Lavrocha, and my daughters, when I came home from shul, I took out a chumash, and they all read the Torah Chumash, Parshas Ki Seitzei, Ke'ikar Hadin. Because Oves Avoisai, Moirai V'Rabosai were never makbid that Noshim should go to shul to hear the Kriyat of Parsha Zohar. I think this year is far more relevant than it ever was. I am extremely terrified of hundreds of women packing into every Ezes Noshim, and this could be a super spreader of COVID-19. So I'm considering even locking the Ezes Noshim in my shul this Shabbos. I am so afraid, because the Ezes Noshim is only a fraction the size of the shul. And our shul has a very high ceiling and good ventilation. The Ezes Noshim is a low room with almost no ventilation, and it's relatively small. So I plea with Noshim whether they're Litvish or Hasidish or Sephardi, don't come to shul to hear the Kriya of Parsha Zachor, because I am very, very afraid of the spread of this terrible disease. One last point. I promised you a fascinating psak. So now it's on the table. Rav Moshe Sternbuch, Shuvas v'Hanhagas, Chelik Beisim and Sadi Gimel, has a fascinating shuva, and it's just a testimony. The Rav in Johannesburg 100 years ago was a Rav Kosovsky. He was a brother-in-law of Reb Chaim Moiser. And he asked Reb Chaim Moiser a shaila, and he said, to my terrible dismay in Johannesburg, we have the entire kehillah comes Friday night to davening, but on Shabbos morning we don't have a minyan. So what do we do with Shabbos Zachor? So Reb Chaim Moiser gave a psak. Friday night after davening, they should take out the Sefer Torah and read Parsha Zachor without a bracha to be mezaka the tzibur. It's a mitzvah d'oraisa. So we should have Kriyas Torah Beleil Shabbos Kodesh. So let me tell you a bit about the kehillah in Johannesburg. I love the kehillah in Johannesburg, and I visited many times. It's the most Litvish community in the world, because practically the entire kehillah is Lithuanian Jews that fled pogroms and anti-Semitism 170 years ago. It was a very liberal kehillah. The HaRav loved to visit Johannesburg. The first big monies he raised for the Panovich Yeshiva was in Johannesburg. They loved him and he loved them because it was a real Litvish community. But 95% of Johannesburg Jews were not from. And that is the way we understand that Rav Kosovsky's shaila to Reb Chaim Moiser. They came Friday night to shul, but Shabbos morning they all went to work. They drove to work, and there wasn't a minyan. So when I visited Johannesburg, I was told a fascinating story about the Panovich HaRav. So the Panovich HaRav, many, many years ago, I think it was right after the liberation, right after the Holocaust, he visited Johannesburg. And it was made public and advertised that there's going to be a drosha after Shachris. Hundreds of people came to Shachris and they listened to the Rav's drosha. They were Litvish and they loved the pilpul. But then after the drosha, suddenly the shul emptied out and they needed to look for a tzenter for a minyan for Musaf. And Panovich HaRav was shocked. And he asked his hosts, where did everybody go? Where's everyone? They smiled and they told him they all drove away to work. They just came because the Rav is here and they wanted to hear the drosha. But when the drosha was over, they all, each of them drove to work. And the Panovich HaRav was taken aback. And at the end of that visit, the entire community came together to say goodbye. And the Panovich HaRav gave them a drosha and he said, my choshev, beloved Talmidim and Hasidim and gute Freund, I want to speak to you about the future of this community. I'll tell you to keep Shabbos. I know you won't listen to me. I'll tell you to keep kashrus and ta'as and mishpacha. Probably wouldn't have much effect. I have one bekosha. And I beg you, just stay away from intermarriage. See that your daughters and your children marry within the fold, because I am confident that Torah will come back. Torah mechazeres anachsan yeshala. You're Lithuanian Jews. You're lovers of Torah. So just see to it that when the Torah wants to come back, she should find an address. She should have to whom to come back. And if your children will marry non-Jewish women, the Torah will have no one to come back to. So please. And they were Makayim. there was almost no intermarriage, zero intermarriage in the Kale of Johannesburg. Lately, to our dismay, there is far more intermarriage than there ever was in the past. On the other hand, there are many Gerim coming. So, this is an interesting psak. Reading Parsha Zocha Balayla, but without a bracha. And Moshe Sternbach writes, but that was an exception. I don't have any source about Kriyas HaTorah by night. So we definitely can't make it the Mina Kavua. So I got some frantic phone calls from Melbourne and Australia this Erev Shabbos. Because there's a surge in COVID-19, the government decided on a strict lockdown. No public gatherings. And that went into effect Friday night, 12 o'clock. So I got 15 frantic phone calls from the Av Basin in Sydney, from the Bonham in Melbourne. What do we do? We could come together Friday night, but Michatzos, no shuls. All the shuls will be closed, so we'll have no Kriyas HaTorah. So I told them, have a proper Kriyas HaTorah, 3 Sifrei Torah, Parshas HaShavua, Rosh Chodesh, Parshas Shkolim, Shiva Kruyim, normal with brachas. The same Kriyas HaTorah instead of the morning, do by night. Did you ever hear of such a psak? I didn't. And my psak is based on the Maharsham, Shuvas Maharsham, Chilek Aleph Kuf Nun Ches. The Maharsham was asked, could we do Kriyas HaTorah before Alois HaShachar? And this question was presented to 2 different Gedolim. Pnei Mevin was one of the Hungarian Gedolim, a contemporary of the Maharsham, Siman Lamed. Shuvas Maharsham, Chilek Aleph, Siman Kuf Nun Ches. The background of the Shaila was people that needed to rush to work. And they couldn't daven with minyan, especially some places in Europe. The Alois is so late part of the year. I know in Moscow, it's 8:30 in the morning, so people need to go to work. So could we have Kriyas HaTorah before the Alois? And the Maharsham argues, yes. Especially Shabbos. Kriyas HaTorah is noyeg bein b'yoyim bein b'laylo. So the proper time is between Shachas and Musaf, but that is not ma'akev. So you could have Kriyas HaTorah before the Alois. The same question was presented to the Pnei Mevin. And usually the background to this question is either people working or Seichen that travel to the Yerid, to the marketplace, or soldiers in Goyish armies. They weren't given time to daven in normal time when the soldiers wake up in the morning, so they needed to get up very early in the morning, and they asked, do we have Kriyas HaTorah before the Alois? The Maharsham paskins, yes. The Pnei Mevin is hesitant, and he argues that there are 2 reasons why Kriyas HaTorah is dafka Sheni and Chamishi. Either because Sheni and Chamishi are Yomei Rachamim, either because Botei Din used to sit Sheni v'Chamishi, and that is when people came together. Both reasons are only Shaykh b'Yoyim v'Loi b'Laylo. So the Maharsham and the Pnei Mevin primarily deal with Kriyas HaTorah in the middle of the week, because Jews go to work. Shabbos, they didn't go to work. I think Shabbos, maybe the Pnei Mevin would agree that it could be Lefnei Alois HaShachar. But even the Pnei Mevin writes, it's not a brocha levatala. I don't think there's any difference between before Alois HaShachar or before Chatzos Laila. Night is night, before the Alois is night. The only reason they talk about the Alois HaShachar, because that was a relevant question they were presented with. However, so if the Maharsham paskins, we could have Kriyas HaTorah before the Alois, and the Pnei Mevin says the same. And the Maharsham was Amoid ha'hiroah shekol beis Yisrael halchem la'oiroi. We definitely could rely on the Maharsham. So my psak to the Kehilas in Australia was you could have the proper Kriyas HaTorah, the Proteo V'Dikdukeo Friday night with a bracha. So why did the Reb Chaim Moses say that you learn without a bracha? I don't know. We don't find the tshuva in Achiezer. So maybe he thought it's preferable, you're only reading Parsha Zohar, you're not having the entire Kriya. So, I don't know, but it's only a shmua. Reb Moshe Sternbach writes, one of the Bnei Kehillah told him that Rav Kosovsky Paskin so many years ago, in the name of Reb Chaim Moshe, I don't know. And Reb Moshe Sternbach writes, I don't have any source about Kriyas HaTorah by night, but I do have two sources, Bnei Maven and the Tshuvas Maharasham. So that was my psak to the Kehillas in Melbourne, in Sydney, in Australia. So today, the Minchas Osher and Corona went to print, and I wrote in the introduction to that sefer, I hope this is the only sefer I ever printed, and I hope none of these tshuvas will be nogea halacha lamaisa by the time the sefer comes out. So these are crazy questions. Shaloi sharum avoseinu. So probably the first tshuva in the world that will be dealing, could you have Kriyas HaTorah by night, Friday night in Shul, will be the Minchas Osher. Well, the first one is the Tshuvas Vanhogas, but that is specifically on Parsha Zohar, not on the entirety of Shiva Kruim. So this is the nature of our period, new shilas that we never needed to deal with. So today we discussed the mitzvah of Tzchias Mas Amolek. From the fundamental sources in the Rishonim regarding the mitzvah d'oraisa, we spoke at length about the minig, Noshim coming to shul, specifically Shabbos Zohar to hear the Kriya of Parsha Zohar. I think this year we should go back to the basic minig of Roiv Kehillas Yisrael, in which it was unheard of. In all the Kehillas in Europe, Central Europe, Southern Europe, Northern Africa, besides in Germany, I think in Germany the winning was, according to the Binyan Sion, Reb Nosson Adler, to have women come to shul to hear Parsha Zohar. And at the end of the shir, I shared with you a very psak that is a precedent. Definitely not bekviyas, chas v'sholem. It's only, an extreme shas at chak, like I just described, that we could have Kriyas HaTorah b'layla. We do have, in many Kriyas HaTorah b'layla, some Chas Torah, but that is a special minhag.